The wind pushed against her small cabin like it wanted to bury her alive. It stole every bit of warmth from her body each time she opened the door. It had been a week since she buried her husband Jacob on the frozen ground just beyond the cabin. His grave was covered with stones to keep the animals away, but no stones could keep away the loneliness that filled her life. Inside the cabin, everything reminded her of Jacob. His chair stood empty by the fire. His razor sat untouched near the sink. His coat still hung by the door, as if waiting for him to return. The silence felt heavy, pressing on her chest like a weight she could not lift. Alara wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders and placed a hand on her belly. Deep inside, a small life was growing. A part of Jacob still lived in her. Instead of comfort, it brought fear. How could she protect a baby when she barely had food for herself? All they had left were a few potatoes, a half sack of flour, and a jar of beans. The firewood was running low, and every log she burned felt like burning the last pieces of Jacob's hard work. Snow began to fall again, sharp and cold. It wasn't gentle like she remembered from childhood. It came sideways with the wind, hitting her skin like tiny stones. She closed the door and sat by the fire. The cabin felt smaller every day, more like a trap than a home. She prayed for strength, but her voice felt too weak to reach anyone. Then the storm came. Not a simple snowfall, but a raging wall of white that erased the world outside. The wind shook the cabin so fiercely she thought the roof might tear off. Snow blocked the windows. The room grew dim, and she stayed curled near the fire to survive the freezing nights. Days passed, but she lost count. She only moved to add wood to the fire and eat small meals to stay alive. She whispered to Jacob, telling him she was scared. Sometimes she wanted to give up, but each time her baby moved inside her, reminding her she wasn't alone. On what felt like the third or fourth day, she heard a loud crack through the storm. It wasn't the wind. It sounded like wood breaking. She rushed to the door, pushed it open, and freezing air hit her like a slap. Through the storm, she saw the barn. The roof had collapsed under the heavy snow. Her heart dropped. Inside that barn were her only animals, Bessie the cow and 2 chickens. Without them, she would not survive the winter. She grabbed a shovel and fought through the wind and snow. She dug and dug, but the snow filled the hole faster than she could clear it. She could not see. Her arms burned. Her lungs hurt. After a long struggle, she dropped the shovel and stumbled back inside. Her last hope was buried, and she collapsed in tears. She believed it was the end. The storm finally stopped. Everything was white and silent. As she looked through the window, she saw nothing but snow covering the land. The barn was broken. All hope felt lost. Then she noticed movement outside. A dark figure slowly walked through the snow. A man. Fear rushed through her. No one came this far from town, especially in winter. She thought he must be trouble, maybe looking for an easy victim. She grabbed Jacob's rifle and watched as he came closer. The man stopped and looked at the barn first, not at her. She recognized him from town. Silas. People called him the half-breed, a man they whispered about. They said he was more animal than human. They said he belonged nowhere. He didn't walk to her door. He walked to the barn. He pulled out a small axe and began clearing the snow with calm, steady movements. He didn't look at her once. He worked for hours without stopping. When the sun began to fall, a weak sound came from the barn. A cow's cry. Bessie was alive. Silas led the cow out and built a small shelter against the cabin wall to protect her from the cold. Then he went back and brought out the chickens. They were alive, too. He made a space for them as well. He turned and looked at Alara through the window for the first time. His eyes were dark and calm. He didn't speak. He only looked at her empty woodpile. She understood. He knew she was out of firewood. Shame filled her chest. He nodded once and walked toward the trees. He returned with enough wood to last a week. He stacked it neatly. Only then did he look ready to leave. Alara opened the door. He stopped. "Wait, I have stew," she said softly. He hesitated, then nodded, and stepped inside. She gave him a small bowl of thin stew, all she could offer. He ate quietly, by the fire. For the first time since Jacob died, the cabin felt less empty. Silas did not leave the next day, or the day after. He repaired the barn, brought food, fixed what was broken, and stayed near the edges of her world without forcing himself into it. Alara's fear slowly changed into curiosity and something else she was afraid to name. Alara never imagined depending on a stranger, but Silas became a steady part of her days. He lived in the barn, fixing, building, and caring for the land the way Jacob once did. He spoke very little, but his actions filled the silence more than words ever could. Each morning, she woke to the sound of his axe hitting wood, or the soft scrape of his knife as he repaired tools. He worked from sunrise to sunset. He rebuilt the damaged barn walls, patched the cabin roof, and hunted small game so she would have meat to cook. He left his catches on her doorstep without asking for thanks. It was clear he knew how to survive harsh land, and without him the winter would have taken her life. Alara watched him carefully. She learned him through his quietness. His movements were strong and sure, yet gentle when needed. The same hands that split wood with one swing could also fix the cow's injured leg with care. He kept his distance, never crossing a line of respect. He seemed to understand she was grieving and carried a secret she was not ready to share. Slowly, the fear she once felt around him changed into something warmer. He didn't try to fill the silence with talk. He didn't pity her. He simply worked and stayed. That alone brought her a comfort she had not expected. One evening, after finishing chores, Silas knocked lightly on the cabin door and handed her something small. It was a tiny bird carved from wood. Simple, but beautifully shaped. No one had given her a gift since Jacob died. Her throat tightened. She whispered a thank you. Silas only nodded and walked away. The snow began to melt, revealing the land beneath. But as the ice faded, a new fear took its place. Winter had kept the world away. Now that roads were open again, trouble could return, and it did. One afternoon, 3 riders came toward the homestead. Alara saw them from the porch. In front rode Jedediah Thorne, a wealthy landowner with a reputation for getting what he wanted through fear. He had tried to buy the land last year, offering a small price that would barely get them to the next town. Jacob had refused. Alara refused too. Thorne looked down at her with a smirk. He ignored Silas, who stood nearby with calm watchfulness. "Widow Hayes," Thorne said in a false, gentle voice, "this land is too much for a woman alone. Sell it to me. I'll give you enough to leave and start over somewhere else." Alara's heart pounded, but she stood tall. "This land isn't for sale." Thorne's smile faded. His eyes grew cold. "You're making a mistake," he warned. His gaze shifted to Silas. "You think that man can protect you? He is nothing. A crippled half-breed outcast. He won't stop what's coming." Silas didn't move. His silence was firm, not fearful. Thorne saw it too. Anger filled his face. He pulled his horse around and left with his men, but not before leaving his threat behind. "You'll regret this. One way or another, this land will be mine." After they disappeared, Alara stood shaking, not from fear but from anger. Silas moved closer, steady as a mountain. She met his eyes and knew without words that he would not let anyone take her home. From that day forward, they prepared. They strengthened the fences, stacked stones, stored food, and checked the rifles. They worked side by side, sharing long days and quiet evenings. During these days of preparation, Alara spoke about Jacob for the first time since his death. She told Silas about Jacob's dream to build a life on the land, a home filled with family and hope. Speaking the memories out loud made her chest ache, but Silas listened with patience. He did not interrupt or offer empty comfort. His quiet listening was the comfort. Later, Silas shared his own burden. He spoke about feeling like he belonged nowhere, not with the settlers, and not with the tribe his mother came from. People called him savage. He had carried that weight alone for years. "I'm not a savage," he said softly. "I'm a survivor. Just like this land." In his eyes, Alara saw a lonely heart that had been hurt by the world but had not turned cruel. She understood him more in that moment than in all the days he had spent working beside her. That night, as she sat sewing by the fire, she felt a sharp movement in her belly. She gasped softly. When she looked up, Silas was watching. His eyes were not on her face but on her hand resting on her stomach. He already knew her secret. He had seen the signs but waited until she was ready to share. He didn't speak. He only gave a slow nod, not questioning her or showing judgment. It was acceptance. And in that acceptance, something deep and strong formed between them. The attack came on a dark night with no moon. Alara woke to the smell of smoke. Fire glowed outside the barn. Silas moved fast into the night. Men were on the land. Thorn's men. Gunshots echoed through the darkness. Alara took Jacob's rifle and aimed through the window to protect Silas. She missed the man, but she scared him enough to throw off his aim. Silas fought like a man who had survived hardship all his life. He drove the attackers back, but one bullet struck him in the arm. He fell to his knees but still defended her until the men ran off, leaving the barn smoking but not destroyed. Silas made it inside, bloody and weak. Alara took charge. She treated his wound with care and firm hands that no longer shook. When he looked at her, there was more than pain in his eyes. There was trust. They both knew Thorn would return with more men. The next fight would be worse. But for the first time, Alara didn't feel alone. She was no longer a widow waiting for life to end. She was ready to fight for her home, her future, and her child. Wait, before we move on, what do you think about the story so far? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm really curious to know. Dawn arrived with a cold, pale light, but Alara and Silas were already awake. They had spent the darkest hours preparing the cabin for the attack they knew was coming. There was no talk of running. No thought of surrender. This was their land now, bonded by struggle and protected with blood. Silas was weak from his wound, but his eyes were clear and steady. Alara loaded the rifles with practiced hands. The fear that once ruled her heart was gone. She felt something new rising inside her. Strength. Purpose. Fight. The sun had barely lifted over the plains when 5 riders appeared. Thorn was at the front, his face full of rage. The failure of the night attack had humiliated him, and a wounded pride was more dangerous than hunger or winter. His voice carried through the cold morning air. "Hayes! This is your last chance. Come out now, or we burn the cabin to the ground." Silas met Alara's eyes. She nodded once. He fired the first shot. One rider fell. Chaos exploded. Gunshots tore through the cabin walls. Splinters flew through the air. Alara aimed out the window, her heart steady, and fired. Her shot struck a horse, sending the rider tumbling to the ground. The attackers panicked. They expected fear, but met resistance. Silas, using only one arm, fired with calm skill. Alara reloaded quickly, keeping their small home defended. When Thorn exposed himself to shout orders, Alara took aim. She remembered Jacob's words about the land, about building a life, not destroying one. She lowered her aim and shot him in the leg instead of the heart. Thorn screamed. His men lost their nerve. Within moments they fled, dragging their wounded leader with them. The prairie swallowed the sound of their retreat. Silence settled over the homestead. Not the silence of grief or loneliness, but the silence that follows survival. Smoke drifted in the air, the smell of gunpowder fading into the wind. Alara lowered her rifle. Her shoulders shook, not with fear, but with relief. She had protected her home. She had protected Silas. She had protected her child. Silas leaned back in his chair, exhausted and pale, his arm bleeding again. Alara rushed to his side, tending to him with gentle hands and fierce care. His eyes never left her face. "You fought," he whispered, voice low and rough. "For my family," she answered without thinking. The word hung between them. Family. It no longer meant the past. It meant now. it meant him. Days passed. No one returned to threaten the land again. The damage around the cabin was repaired piece by piece. Life slowly settled into a new kind of quiet rhythm, but it was no longer the silence of sadness. It was peace. As spring warmed the earth, the land began to bloom with new life. Flowers pushed through the soil, the creek sang louder. Bessie recovered, and the chickens laid eggs again. Silas healed too, though his left arm never regained full strength. He moved slower sometimes, and pain showed on his face in small moments. But he never complained, never stopped working. The people from town eventually learned what had happened. They whispered about the widow and the wounded man who stood against Thorn and won. Slowly, the whispers changed. They weren't mocking anymore. They were full of respect, admiration. Some even came to help mend fences and rebuild the barn. The story of a crippled half-breed saving a widow became something else entirely. Silas became known as the pride of the plains. One warm evening, Alara stood on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in gold. Silas stepped beside her. For the first time since he arrived, his posture was not guarded. He looked at her with a softness she had never seen from him. "You don't have to stay because of the fight," Alara said, her voice gentle. "You have your own life." Silas shook his head. "This is my life," he said. "This land, this home, if you will have me here." Alara's hand went to her belly. The baby moved, as if answering for her. She reached for Silas's hand and placed it over where the child kicked. His eyes widened with surprise, then softened with something deep and full. "You protected us," she said. "You gave us a chance to live. This land isn't mine alone, it's ours." Silas looked at her the way a man looks at the first sunrise after a long winter, full of hope he never believed he would feel again. Slowly, he reached up and touched her cheek, his hand gentle and unsure, as if afraid she might pull away. She didn't. They stood together as the sun dipped behind the horizon, two souls, once alone, now finding home in each other. Months later, when the baby was born, the first cry of new life filled the cabin. Lara held the child close, tears running down her face. Silas sat beside her, his good hand resting on hers, his eyes filled with emotion he couldn't speak. They named the baby Jacob Silas Hayes, a name built from the past that shaped them and the man who saved them. Their home on the plains became a place of warmth and welcome. Travelers who passed by spoke of the strong woman and the brave man who built a life from loss. And the land they fought for grew green and prosperous, full of laughter, family, and hope. The widow who once waited for death became a wife again. The man the world rejected found a place he finally belonged, and together they built a love story the plains would remember for generations. Their story began in snow and sorrow, but it grew into a tale of strength, healing, and a love stronger than the hardest winter.